The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly upon the red clay soil of the village, as if the heavens had decided to pour all their fire onto the earth below. The heat shimmered in waves above the ground, distorting the horizon into a dancing mirage. Dust particles hung suspended in the still air, catching the light like tiny fragments of amber. In front of a modest mud brick house, weathered by countless seasons of rain and drought, sat a small but sturdy woman on an old woven mat. This was Ibrahim Traoré, her hands moving with practiced efficiency as she peeled fresh cassava roots, the white flesh of the tubers contrasting sharply with the dark earth beneath her. Her eyes held a peculiar tranquility, a peace that neither the oppressive heat nor the passage of time could disturb. The lines on her face told stories of hardship endured and overcome, of laughter shared and tears shed, of a life lived fully in service to others. Around her, the village continued its lazy afternoon rhythm. Chickens scratched in the dust nearby, their soft clucking punctuating the silence. A dog lay in the shade of a neem tree, its sides rising and falling slowly. Children's voices carried from somewhere beyond the houses, high and bright with the joy of play. This was Ibrahim's world, simple, honest, and entirely her own. The peace was shattered by the appearance of a black government vehicle, its polished surface incongruous against the rustic backdrop. It kicked up clouds of red dust as it rolled to a stop in the village center, its engine ticking as it cooled. 3 men emerged from the vehicle, their city clothes and formal bearing marking them as outsiders. They were the senior advisor, a security officer whose eyes constantly scanned the perimeter, and the Minister of Housing, his briefcase clutched importantly under his arm. Their faces bore expressions of practiced politeness, the kind of formal courtesy that people in positions of authority wear like armor. They approached Ibrahim's home with careful steps, as if uncertain of their welcome. The senior advisor cleared his throat and spoke in the measured tones of official business. "Madam Traoré," he began, his voice carrying the weight of government authority, "we have come to relocate you to a secure government villa. These are the president's orders." Ibrahim continued peeling her cassava as if she hadn't heard a word. Her knife moved steadily, the peel falling away in long, continuous strips. The silence stretched between them, growing heavier with each passing moment. Finally, without looking up, she spoke in a calm, measured tone that carried more authority than all their official positions combined. "I will not go." The words landed like stones in still water, creating ripples of confusion and discomfort among the delegation. They exchanged uncertain glances, their carefully prepared speeches suddenly seeming inadequate. The minister shifted his weight from foot to foot, his briefcase now feeling like a burden rather than a badge of office. The housing minister cleared his throat, trying again with a different approach. "Madam, with all due respect, this is not about comfort, this is about security. You are no longer just a mother. You have become a national symbol. Your safety is a matter of state concern." At this, Ibrahim set down her knife and looked up at them properly for the first time. She studied each face in turn, her gaze penetrating and assessing. When she spoke, her voice was gentle but firm, carrying the weight of absolute conviction. "I became a mother the day my son was born, when no one knew his name," she said quietly. "And I will remain a mother when his title and position are nothing but memories. My identity is not tied to his office." The senior advisor tried another tack, his voice taking on a more persuasive tone. "The villa has everything you could need. Clean running water from deep wells, not the river. A full staff to attend to your every need. A beautiful garden with fruit trees and flowering plants. We've even designed the kitchen in the traditional style of your village, with a clay hearth exactly like the one you use now." A small smile played at the corners of Ibrahim's lips, but her eyes grew sharper, more focused. The question she asked next stopped them all in their tracks. "And how many villages still drink from the contaminated river?" The question hung in the air like an accusation, though Ibrahim's tone held no malice. It was simply a statement of fact, a reminder of reality that existed beyond the walls of government villas and the comfort of official privilege. Outside, even the chickens seemed to fall silent, as if nature itself was waiting for an answer that would not come. The officials looked at each other, then at the ground. The housing minister opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it again. There was no good answer to give, and they all knew it. The statistics were damning. Hundreds of villages still relied on water sources that had been declared unsafe years ago. Promises had been made, budgets allocated, but somehow the work remained undone while resources were diverted to projects deemed more pressing by those in power. Amina stood up slowly, her joints protesting slightly after sitting for so long. She walked to the doorway of her home and stepped out into the bright sunlight. Her hand came up to shade her eyes as she looked across the village. In the distance, she could see children running toward her, their faces bright with smiles. They called out to her, waving enthusiastically, and she returned their greeting with genuine warmth. "This," she said, gesturing to the village, to the children, to the simple houses with their mud walls and thatched roofs, "this is my security. These people, this place, this is where I am protected by truth and community. Not by guards and gates." A young officer, perhaps 25 years old and new to his position, found the courage to speak. His voice was hesitant, almost apologetic. "Madam, aren't you afraid? The intelligence report suggests that extremist groups may target you specifically. They want to hurt the president by hurting you. Doesn't that frighten you?" Amina turned to look at him directly, and her expression softened. She saw in his face genuine concern rather than political calculation, and she respected that. When she answered, her voice was gentle but carried a depth that made them all lean in to listen. "My son is not a king or an emperor," she said slowly, choosing each word with care. "He is a servant of the people. If he has brought justice, if he has fulfilled his promises and his duty, then I do not need walls or guards to protect me. The truth and the goodness of his work will be my shield. But if he has not brought justice, if his work is incomplete or corrupt, then no palace, no fortress, no army can save me from the consequences of that failure. The truth will find me regardless." The silence that followed was profound. The officials stood rooted to the spot, their carefully constructed arguments crumbling in the face of this simple logic. They had come prepared with security protocols and threat assessments, with floor plans and staff rosters. But they had not come prepared for the moral clarity of a woman who refused to be separated from the consequences of her son's leadership. Half an hour later, the convoy departed, leaving behind nothing but dust and the distant sound of their engines fading into the afternoon heat. Amina returned to her mat, settled herself comfortably, and resumed peeling cassava as if nothing had happened. Her hands moved with the same steady rhythm, her expression peaceful and content. In the capital city, in the imposing government palace with its marble floors and air-conditioned corridors, President Ibrahim Traoré received the report. He sat at his massive desk, surrounded by the trappings of power, leather-bound books, flags, portraits of former leaders. The paper in front of him had a single red line underlined for emphasis. "She has refused the villa." For a long moment, Ibrahim simply stared at the words. Then, slowly, a smile spread across his face. It was not the practiced smile of a politician, not the careful expression he wore in photographs and public appearances. This was genuine, filled with something like relief and pride and a deep, abiding love. He opened a drawer in his desk and withdrew an old photograph, its edges worn from being handled many times over the years. The image showed a young boy, perhaps 12 years old, covered in mud from head to toe. He was carrying a bucket of water, his arms straining with the weight. Behind him stood a woman, younger then, but unmistakably Amina, laughing at something the boy had said. Her face was radiant with joy and pride. Ibrahim touched the photograph gently, his finger tracing the outline of his mother's face. "You are still teaching me," he whispered to the image. "After all these years, after everything that has changed, you are still showing me what truly matters." He thought back to his childhood, to the lessons his mother had taught him not through words but through example. He remembered how she had never wasted a single drop of water, how she had always fed others before herself, how she had spoken only words that built up rather than tore down. These lessons had seemed simple then, almost insignificant. But now, sitting in this palace, wielding power over millions of lives, he understood their profound importance. the news of Amina's refusal spread through the capital like wildfire. It began in the marketplace, where vendors discussed it between customers. It moved to the radio stations, where broadcasters debated its meaning and significance. It reached the military barracks, where young soldiers talked quietly among themselves during their breaks. And everywhere it went, it carried the same powerful message. Amina's words echoing in countless retellings. If my son has brought justice, I do not need walls. The phrase seemed to resonate with something deep in the national consciousness. It spoke to the frustration people felt with corruption and inequality, with the distance between promises and reality. But it also spoke to hope, the possibility that leadership could be different, that those in power could be held accountable not through elections or protests alone, but through the moral authority of those who had sacrificed most to see them rise. Young soldiers, in particular, seemed moved by Amina's stance. In their barracks late at night, they talked about what it meant. If she refuses to hide behind walls, one young corporal said to his fellows, then we should not let her stand alone. If she is willing to face danger to prove a point about justice, then we should honor that courage. That very night, without receiving orders or seeking permission, several soldiers made their way to the village. They didn't announce themselves or make a show of their presence. They simply took up positions on the outskirts, watching quietly through the darkness. By morning, more had joined them, not just military personnel, but teachers, nurses, farmers, ordinary citizens who felt compelled to add their silent witness to Amina's stand. When Amina emerged from her house at dawn, she found them there. She said nothing about their presence, offered no speeches or acknowledgments. She simply did what she always did. She made tea. Pot after pot of sweet, strong tea carried out on trays by village children, shared among strangers who became, in that moment of shared purpose, something more than strangers. Several days passed before another convoy arrived, this one even more official than the first. They brought with them architectural drawings, photographs of the proposed villa rendered in glossy color prints, and signed statements from security experts and government ministers. The delegation was led by a high-ranking officer from the Ministry of Defense, a man whose uniform bore enough medals to suggest he had seen real combat, not just ceremonial duties. Madame Traoré, he began, his voice carrying military precision. Your current location is indefensible. Our intelligence suggests that extremist groups have identified you as a priority target. They are using your name in their propaganda, suggesting that striking at you would strike at the heart of the government. Amina listened patiently, letting him finish his prepared speech. Then she picked up one of the glossy photographs they had spread before her, an image of the villa's master bedroom. All cream-colored walls and expensive fabrics, soft lighting and modern furniture. Who designed this? She asked, her finger tapping the image. A local architect, the officer replied, somewhat confused by the question. One of the best in the capital. He consulted with cultural experts to ensure it would be appropriate. My tradition, Amina said quietly, does not live in curtains and comfortable mattresses. My tradition lives in people, in community, in the way we care for one another. Did this architect leave space in his design for the widow whose roof collapsed? For the neighbor who has nowhere to sleep? For the child who needs a meal? Silence greeted her question. The officer looked at his papers as if they might contain an answer, but they did not. After a moment, Amina stood and walked to the corner of her yard. She pointed to a spot near the back wall. Last week, a widow slept here because her house was damaged in the rains. Your guards, who have been watching this place, did they see her? Did they think about her security, her dignity? Or were they only watching me? The officer shifted uncomfortably. Madam, this is about your safety specifically. We cannot. It is never just about me, Amina interrupted, her voice firm now. The day your name becomes attached to schools and hospitals, to justice and mercy, to the welfare of the people, that day, your existence becomes everyone's concern. You cannot separate yourself from it. You cannot pick and choose when to be a symbol and when to be just a person. That choice is no longer yours to make. The housing minister, who had remained silent until now, made one last attempt. Madam, this villa is your right. You have earned it through your sacrifices, through the years you supported your son's education and career. No one would fault you for accepting what is rightfully yours. Amina turned to him with a look that was not unkind, but was unflinching in its directness. "How many mothers," she asked, "will sleep tonight without guards? How many mothers have lost sons in the northern conflict, in the border skirmishes, in the fight against corruption and extremism? How many of them have been offered villas?" She disappeared into her house and returned carrying a small wooden box, its surface worn smooth by age and handling. She opened it carefully, revealing bundles of letters tied with faded ribbon. "These," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "are letters from the families of soldiers who died in the Northern Campaign. They did not ask me for a palace. They did not demand special treatment. They simply asked that I remember their sons, that I live in a way that honors their sacrifice. How can I accept luxury while their letters remind me of the cost of service?" The silence that followed was broken only by the distant sound of children playing and the rustle of wind through the neem tree. One of the younger soldiers in the delegation, a man perhaps in his late 20s, spoke softly, almost to himself. "We built a fortress for a woman who does not fear death." Amina heard him and responded with gentle correction. "I do fear death," she said. "I fear it very much, but I fear the death of truth more. I fear the death of simplicity, of integrity, of genuine connection between people. I fear a world where we build walls not just around our bodies but around our hearts. Those deaths frighten me far more than any physical threat." As the delegation prepared to leave, a young boy, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, ran up to their vehicle. He carried a piece of paper which he quickly taped to the window before running away, giggling. The message, written in a child's careful handwriting, read, "Tell the president his mother still lives where he left her. President Ibrahim Traoré had not been born in a palace. His childhood had been spent in houses with mud walls and leaking roofs, in yards where chickens and children ran together, in rooms where privacy was a luxury unknown. His mother had raised him with lessons that seemed harsh at the time, but which he now understood as precious gifts. She had taught him never to waste water, not even a single drop. In a land where drought could last for months, where wells ran dry and rivers became trickles, water was life itself. She had taught him to feed others before himself, to ensure that guests and the hungry were satisfied before he took his own portion. She had taught him to speak carefully, to weigh his words and ensure that they built up rather than tore down, that they healed rather than wounded. When he had become a military captain, rising through the ranks through merit and determination, every letter home had ended the same way. "I am still your son." It was his way of grounding himself, of remembering that rank and title were temporary, but the values his mother had instilled were permanent. Now, sitting in his office with its bulletproof windows and satellite communications, he pulled out some of those old letters. His handwriting had changed over the years, more assured, more official, but the sentiment remained the same. Reading them now, he could hear his younger self trying to hold on to something essential, something that power and position threatened to erode. An urgent security meeting interrupted his reflections. Intelligence officers spread maps and reports across the conference table, their faces grave with concern. The threat was real and specific. Extremist groups, frustrated by the government's anti-corruption campaigns and military successes against their strongholds, had identified Amina as a symbolic target. Striking at the president's mother, they reasoned, would demonstrate that no one was beyond their reach. "We need to extract her immediately," the defense minister insisted, his fist striking the table for emphasis. "We cannot afford to lose her. The political ramifications alone." A younger commander interrupted, his voice respectful but firm. This woman did not bend during the Civil War. She did not break during the occupation. She was taken hostage twice and emerged each time with her dignity intact. She survived imprisonment, torture, and the loss of her husband. She will not be moved by threats now. Ibrahim listened to the debate with a heavy heart. He knew both sides were right. The danger was real, but his mother's resolve was absolute. Finally, he spoke, his voice carrying the authority of his office, but also the pain of a son who could not protect his mother. "Send our best people," he said quietly. "But understand, they are not going to force her to leave. They are going to explain the danger, and if she still refuses, they will protect her where she is. We do not make prisoners of those we seek to protect. The elite commando unit arrived at the village at dusk, their vehicles unmarked and their movements precise. Their leader, a woman named Captain Zara, who had seen action in 3 conflict zones, approached Amina's house with a mixture of professional concern and personal respect. "Madam," she said without preamble, sitting down beside Amina on the mat without waiting for an invitation, "the threat is real. We have intercepted communications. They are planning something. You need to leave. Today." Amina continued slicing mangoes, the knife moving with practiced ease. She set aside the peel and looked at the captain with an expression that was almost amused. "If I leave," she said calmly, "what message does that send? It says that honor and dignity exist only behind walls. It says that truth can be threatened into hiding. It says that we believe our own fear more than we believe in the justice we claim to have established." Captain Zara opened her mouth to argue, then closed it again. She had been prepared for denial, for stubbornness, even for foolish bravery. But this was something different, a philosophical position that she could not easily counter with tactical arguments. "We could move the entire village," the captain tried. "Establish a secure perimeter that what?" Amina interrupted gently. "That turns a community into a prison? That teaches people to run rather than stand? Captain, you are a soldier. You have faced danger many times. Did you face it because you were unafraid, or because you believed in something worth the fear?" The captain was silent for a long moment. Finally, she stood and gave a sharp salute, not the casual acknowledgement of rank, but the deep, formal salute reserved for true respect. "We will establish a perimeter," she said, "not to imprison you, but to honor your courage. You will not stand alone." And so the village gained silent guardians. They positioned themselves not at Amina's door, but at the village boundaries. They dressed in civilian clothes during the day, becoming part of the landscape. At night, they watched with night vision equipment and secure communications. But they never interfered with the rhythm of village life, never inserted themselves between Amina and her community. As days turned into weeks, Amina's story began to spread beyond local radio stations and national news. First, the regional networks picked it up, framing it as a human interest story about tradition versus modernity. Then the major international channels discovered it, and suddenly journalists from around the world were requesting interviews, offering substantial fees for exclusive access. A senior European journalist arrived with a translator and camera crew, prepared to document what she assumed would be a compelling story about a stubborn old woman and the patient son who humored her. But when she actually met Amina, her assumptions quickly dissolved. The journalist knocked on the door, her equipment ready, her questions prepared. Amina came to the doorway but did not invite them in. When the journalist explained that she wanted to tell Amina's story to the world, Amina smiled and shook her head. "I am not a story," she said gently. "The story is these people," she gestured to the village around them, "who live with dignity despite hardship. The story is the teachers who work in buildings with no roofs, the nurses who travel hours on dirt roads to reach patients, the children who study by lamplight because there is no electricity. If you want to tell a story, tell theirs." The journalist, experienced enough to recognize when she had encountered something genuine, did exactly that. She spent 3 days in the village, not filming Amina but documenting the lives around her. She interviewed teachers sitting on broken boxes in the schoolyard. She recorded children laughing as they drew water from the well. She spoke with a retired teacher who offered tea and a profound observation. Titles and positions come and go like seasons. But the way someone lives without titles, that remains. The resulting piece aired worldwide. 3 minutes of footage showing not Amina, but the village. Not the president's mother, but a community. And in the background, barely visible, that phrase appeared in subtitles: "If my son has brought justice, I do not need walls." The impact was immediate and profound. People began writing the phrase on walls, on banners, on social media. It became a litmus test for leadership, a challenge to those in power. "If you have truly served," it asked, "why do you need such elaborate protection? If your work is just, why do you hide behind gates and guards?" Letters began arriving at Amina's home. Dozens at first, then hundreds. They came from across the country and beyond, from people who felt connected to something they couldn't quite name but recognized as essential. One letter, arriving in an envelope made from newspaper, particularly moved Amina. It was from a girl named Asata, written in careful handwriting that showed the effort of someone still learning to write. Dear Mother Amina, my name is Asata. I am 9 years old. People tell me you could live in a house with tiles and running water, but you chose to stay in your village. Because of you, I go to school with pride. My own mother died when I was small, but when I hear about you, I feel like you are a mother to all of us who have no mother. Thank you for showing us that being important does not mean forgetting where you came from. With respect, Asata Amina held that letter to her chest, her eyes filling with tears. She carefully placed it in her old prayer book, between pages that spoke of patience and refuge, and sat for a long time listening to children playing outside. Their laughter seemed like a prayer in itself, a benediction on her choice. The storm came without warning one evening, as storms often do in that region. The sky darkened to an unnatural shade of green, and the wind began to howl like something alive and angry. By the next morning, a sandstorm of unusual ferocity had descended upon the village, tearing at roofs and threatening to destroy everything in its path. Amina's roof, patched many times over the years but fundamentally sound, began to fail under the assault. She heard the ominous cracking of timbers, saw one corner of the thatched covering begin to lift and tear away. She wrapped cloth around her head and stepped outside, intending to assess the damage and perhaps secure what she could. She was alone for perhaps 30 seconds. As soon as the villagers saw her standing there, struggling against the wind, they emerged from their own homes. It didn't matter that their own roofs needed attention, that their own possessions were at risk. They came with ropes and mud, with old beams and strong hands. A young man brought a ladder and held it steady while his father climbed up. A girl, no more than 12, used her scarf to tie loose thatch more securely. A 10-year-old boy crawled beneath the house to clear the drainage channel of sand, ensuring water wouldn't pool and weaken the structure further. No one issued orders or organized the effort. It simply happened, as naturally as breathing, each person knowing what needed to be done and doing it. They worked silently for the most part, communicating through gestures and shared understanding. Against the fury of nature, they formed a human wall. When the storm finally broke and the wind died down, the roof was secure. Damaged, yes, but still functional. Amina ran her hand along the newly secured timbers, feeling the traces of community effort in every nail and rope. She spoke so softly that only those nearest could hear. You did not come for me. You came because I would have come for you. The people smiled, tired but satisfied, and returned to their own homes. Someone using charcoal on a wall wrote, "Not a princess, a root." The metaphor was perfect. Roots did not sit above the soil demanding attention. They went deep, connected to everything, essential, but often invisible. That same week, the architect who had designed the rejected villa made an unexpected journey. He arrived alone, without fanfare or official delegation, wearing dusty pants and carrying nothing but a small bag. He found Amina in her garden and sat down on the ground beside her without invitation. "I have come to apologize," he said simply. "We built a beautiful house, but we failed to understand the truth of what you needed. We designed walls without understanding that some people are not meant to be contained by walls." Amina laughed, not mockingly, but with genuine amusement and affection. "Roots do not move to new soil just because the pot is pretty," she observed. The architect pressed his hands together in a gesture of respect. As he stood to leave, Amina spoke again, her voice gentle but carrying a challenge. "If you truly want to honor me, build roofs for women who have no walls. Build homes for those who sleep." The architect returned to the city and immediately began working on new plans. He titled the project Amina's Honor Houses and began coordinating with social workers to identify the most vulnerable families, widows, orphans, those displaced by conflict or natural disaster. The homes he designed were small but thoughtfully crafted, with large courtyards for community gathering, shaded porches for hot afternoons, rooms designed to hold hope rather than just furniture. The first key was given to a widow in a remote town, and on the door, a plaque was mounted. "This is not charity, this is remembrance." The architect had learned his lesson. Honor was not about grand gestures for important people. It was about ensuring that everyone had access to basic dignity. As weeks turned into months, something organic and unplanned began to happen in the village. People started gathering near Amina's home in the evenings. They didn't call it a ritual or give it a formal name. It simply became what they did. Sometimes they sat in silence, watching the sun set and feeling the relief of cooler evening air. Sometimes they talked quietly about their days, their hopes, their concerns. Children played nearby, their games ranging around the adults like water around stones. Someone carved words into a piece of old wood and propped it against a wall. "We have lost much, but not everything." The phrase seemed to capture something essential about the community, an acknowledgement of hardship without surrender to despair. The soldiers who still maintained their discreet perimeter sometimes joined these gatherings, removing their boots and sitting at the edge of the mat. One evening, a young soldier lit a candle and no one asked him why. The shared silence was answer enough. A young photographer from the city came to take pictures. He set up his camera, took a few shots, then found himself putting the equipment down and simply sitting with everyone else. Later, he wrote in his journal, "This is a place where power does not stand tall, it kneels in respect." In his quiet office in the capital, President Ibrahim stood before a photograph captured by a drone, an aerial view of his mother's home. The image showed the mat, the well, the shadow of the neem tree, and the simple geometry of village life. He had not called for translators or speechwriters, had not convened committees to draft an official response. Instead, he pulled out a file and wrote by hand, his pen moving steadily across the paper, "Do not build a monument. Do not rename a street or plaza. Instead, establish in the northern provinces an institution for women's education, governed not by the state, but by the community. Give honor to those who do not seek it. This is how we remember what matters." He signed the order and sent it forward. No press conference announced it. No grand ceremony marked its implementation. The work simply began, quietly and purposefully, in places where it was needed most. That night in the village, nothing changed. The cooking pot bubbled slowly on the hearth, sending the familiar aroma of evening meal into the air. The mat remained in its usual place, worn smooth by use and weather. The washed sky stretched overhead, infinite and indifferent to human concerns. Amina sat near a small lamp, threading a needle with patient care. She opened her prayer book and found Asata's letter pressed between its pages. She placed her hand on it and bowed her head, as if prayer and gratitude were the same breath, the same essential act. Outside, a child passed by and ran their hand along the wall where someone had written the now famous phrase. The dust stirred slightly, carrying not sand, but meaning. And the world, which typically chased after big headlines and dramatic developments, found itself gradually stilling around this small house. Because one woman had refused to move, and in that refusal, had taught everyone else how to stand their ground. In the months that followed, Amina's choice began to influence decisions far beyond the village. When a regional governor proposed building herself a luxury residence, citizens pointed to Amina's example, and the governor quietly withdrew the proposal. When military officers sought additional personal security details, they found themselves questioned about whether such measures were truly necessary or merely comfortable. Teachers in remote schools, working in difficult conditions, drew courage from the story. If the president's own mother chose simplicity, they reasoned, then their own dedication to education in challenging circumstances carried honor rather than shame. Medical workers, nurses traveling long distances to reach patients, found in Amina's story a validation of their choice to serve where service was difficult. Her refusal to abandon her community for personal comfort mirrored their own daily decisions to prioritize purpose over ease. Young people, especially, seemed moved by the narrative. In universities and colleges, student groups organized discussions about authentic leadership, about the relationship between power and humility, about what it meant to serve rather than to rule. Amina's name came up again and again, not as a political symbol, but as a moral touchstone. Letters continued to arrive. Some came from other mothers who had lost sons in conflict, thanking her for remembering. Some came from young women pursuing education despite obstacles, saying that her example gave them strength. Some came from people in positions of power, admitting that her choice challenged them to reconsider their own relationship with privilege. One letter from a businessman in the capital was particularly striking. He wrote that he had been planning to build a mansion as a symbol of his success. After learning of Amina's story, he had instead funded the construction of a medical clinic in an underserved area. I realized, he wrote, that I wanted my legacy to be something more than just comfortable rooms I would occupy alone. A respected journalist, known for her thoughtful long-form pieces, was finally granted permission to visit the village. Unlike others who had come seeking spectacle, she approached with humility and patience. She spent a week living in the village, not in pursuit of an interview, but in observation of daily life. On her last day, she found Amina alone in the early morning, drawing water from the well. The journalist helped her carry the bucket back to the house, and they sat together in the pre-dawn quiet. "People want to understand," the journalist said carefully. "They want to know the philosophy behind your choice. They ask me to explain it in ways that make sense to city people, to educated people, to people who think in political terms." Amina was quiet for a long moment, watching the sky lighten in the east. When she spoke, her words were simple but crystalline in their clarity. "There is no philosophy," she said. "Philosophy is for people who think with their heads alone. I think with my life. This," she gestured to the village waking around them, "is not a statement. It is simply who I am. To leave would not be wrong because of politics or symbolism. It would be wrong because it would be untrue to my life, to the person I have always been." She paused, then continued. "When my son was young, I taught him that you cannot love people in theory. You cannot serve them from a distance. You cannot understand their struggles if you remove yourself from their reality. Those lessons were not political, they were human. Now people want to make them political, to turn them into movements and causes. But at the root, they are just about being true to who you say you are." The journalist wrote furiously, trying to capture not just the words, but the quality of voice, the gesture of hands, the complete absence of self-importance. "And the danger?" the journalist asked. "The real threat to your life?" "I am an old woman," Amina said with a slight smile. "I have lived a full life. I have raised a good son. I have loved and been loved. I have seen my community struggle and persist and find joy even in hardship. Death, when it comes, will find me where I belong. That is not brave. It is simply honest." The journalist's piece, when published, sparked conversations across continents. It appeared in newspapers from Paris to Tokyo, from New York to Johannesburg. Television networks featured segments discussing what came to be known as the Tarot Principle, the idea that authentic leadership required those in power to remain connected to the realities of those they served. Academic conferences began examining the phenomenon. Political scientists wrote papers analyzing the relationship between symbolic gestures and substantive governance. Philosophers debated whether Amina's choice represented a form of moral absolutism or practical wisdom. Theologians from various traditions found in her stance echoes of their own teachings about humility and service. But perhaps the most significant response came from ordinary people around the world who faced their own versions of the same choice, whether to insulate themselves from difficulty or to remain engaged with the struggles of their communities. A doctor in a wealthy neighborhood reconsidered his plan to move his practice to an exclusive area, choosing instead to maintain his clinic in a working-class district. A teacher who had been offered a position at an elite private school decided to stay at the public school where she was needed most. A lawyer turned down a lucrative corporate position to continue representing clients who could barely afford her services. None of these people made their decisions because of direct political influence. They simply found in Amina's story a validation of impulses they had already felt, the sense that personal comfort, while pleasant, was not the highest goal of a life well lived. The security services had been right to worry. The extremist group, frustrated by their inability to strike at the government directly, began planning an operation specifically targeting Amina. They saw in her symbolic value an opportunity. If they could harm her, they reasoned, they would demonstrate the government's inability to protect even its most cherished figures. Intelligence intercepted fragments of their planning. The threat assessment became increasingly specific. A small team, weapons smuggled across the border, a plan to strike during the evening when the village was most vulnerable. Captain Zara, who had been coordinating security from a distance, received the updated intelligence at 3:00 a.m. She immediately mobilized her team, but she faced a terrible dilemma. To fully secure the village would require an obvious military presence, exactly what Amina had refused to accept. But to maintain the current light footprint might mean inadequate protection. She decided to split the difference. Overnight, she positioned additional units in the surrounding area, but kept them concealed in the brush and abandoned buildings beyond the village proper. Within the village itself, she increased the number of plainclothes operatives but made sure they maintained their civilian appearance. Then she did something unusual. She went to Amina's home just before dawn and told her, honestly and completely, about the specific threat. "They are coming," she said without preamble. "Probably within the next 48 hours. We have increased security, but I need you to understand this is not theoretical anymore. This is real, and it is imminent." Amina listened carefully, her expression thoughtful but unafraid. "What would you have me do?" she asked. "Leave," Captain Zara said bluntly. "Even just for a week while we neutralize the threat. Go to your son's residence or to a safe house we've prepared. Let us do our job without having to worry about you." "And what will people learn if I run?" Amina asked gently. "They will learn that you are wise enough to avoid unnecessary risk," the captain replied, frustration creeping into her voice. "Or they will learn that courage is only for when there is no real danger," Amina countered. "Captain, I do not dismiss your concerns. I know the threat is real, but the principle is also real. If I leave now, I confirm that security comes from walls and weapons, not from justice and community. I cannot teach that lesson." Captain Zara wanted to argue further, but found she could not. There was a logic to Amina's position that transcended tactical considerations. Finally, she simply nodded and said, "Then we protect you here, but please stay inside after dark. At least give us that advantage." Amina agreed to this small compromise, and Captain Zara left to brief her team. As she walked back to her command post, she found herself thinking about her own life, her own choices. She had joined the military to serve her country, to protect people. But somewhere along the way, the mission had become abstract, protecting borders, securing installations, eliminating threats. When had she last thought about what she was protecting in human terms? Amina had reminded her. This was not about tactical advantages or strategic considerations. It was about whether people could live with dignity, whether communities could function without fear, whether justice was real or merely claimed. News of the specific threat spread through the village, though Captain Zara never officially disclosed it. Small communities have their own information networks, and whispers travel faster than official communications. The response was not panic, but preparation. Not the preparation of weapons and barricades, but the preparation of community. If danger was coming, people reasoned, they would face it together. An informal rotation began. Men and women took turns sitting outside in the evening, not as guards but as presents. They brought their work with them, mending clothes, preparing food, talking quietly. The message was clear. This is our home, and we do not abandon it to fear. Children continued their games, though parents kept them closer. The school remained open, though teachers walked students home in groups. Life continued, defiantly normal, a refusal to let threats dictate the rhythm of existence. One evening, a young man named Kofi organized something unusual. He gathered musicians from the village and several neighboring communities, drummers, singers, players of traditional instruments. Without announcement or explanation, they began to play near Amina's home. The music was not celebratory or defiant. It was simply beautiful. The songs of their people, the rhythms that had sustained them through generations of hardship and joy. People emerged from their homes and joined in, some singing, some dancing, some simply swaying in place. Amina came to her doorway and watched, tears streaming down her face. This was her protection, not walls or weapons, but the unbreakable bonds of community, the collective determination to preserve what was good and true. From his concealed position in the darkness beyond the village, a young soldier radioed to Captain Zara. "Are you seeing this?" "Yes," she replied quietly. "I'm seeing it. What should we do?" "Our job," she said. "We protect them. But maybe we also learn from them." The extremist team arrived 2 nights later, moving under cover of darkness across terrain they had studied carefully. There were 5 of them, armed and committed, believing their cause justified any action. They approached from the south, where the village bordered uncultivated land. Their plan was simple: create a diversion with a small explosion, use the confusion to reach Amina's home, and escape in the chaos. They never got close. The first indication something was wrong came when they encountered not military patrols, but villagers, ordinary people who happened to be outside, who noticed strangers moving with suspicious purpose, who raised an alarm not with sirens but with a traditional warning call that every resident recognized instantly. Within seconds, lights came on throughout the village. People emerged from homes, not to confront the intruders but to bear witness. The extremists found themselves surrounded not by soldiers, but by a community that refused to be intimidated. Captain Zara's team moved in smoothly, professionally, from multiple directions. The extremists found themselves outflanked and outnumbered before they could react. 3 surrendered immediately. 2 tried to run and were tackled by soldiers who had been waiting for exactly this scenario. The entire confrontation lasted less than 5 minutes. No shots were fired. No one was injured. The threat that had seemed so ominous evaporated in the face of coordinated defense and community vigilance. Amina, who had remained inside as promised, emerged only after the all-clear was given. She looked at the captured men, young, frightened now that their moment of action had failed, and felt not triumph, but sadness. "Why?" she asked one of them, a boy who could not have been more than 20. He stared at her, confused by the question, unable or unwilling to answer. "You came to hurt an old woman because you are angry with her son," Amina continued. "But I am not my son's power. I am his conscience. To attack me is to prove you have no understanding of what truly threatens you." The young man looked away, shame flickering across his face. Captain Zara stepped forward. "Madam, we need to take them for questioning." "Of course," Amina said. "But Captain, when you question them, try to understand what brought them to this. Fear and desperation do not excuse violence, but perhaps understanding them can prevent the next attempt." As the prisoners were led away and the village slowly returned to calm, Amina sat down on her mat. The night's events had shaken her more than she had let show, but her conviction remained unshaken. She had been right to stay. The community had been right to stand together. Violence had been met not with greater violence, but with solidarity and competent defense. In the days following the attempted attack, pressure mounted from multiple directions for Amina to reconsider her position. Government officials argued that she had proven her point and could now safely accept enhanced protection. Security experts used the incident as evidence that their concerns had been justified all along. But others drew a different conclusion. The attack had failed not because of elaborate security systems or fortified locations, but because of community vigilance and coordinated response. The combination of engaged citizens and professional security had proven more effective than any isolated fortress could have been. President Ibrahim addressed the nation 3 days after the incident. He spoke from his office, sitting at his desk, his manner serious but calm. "My mother was targeted because those who oppose justice and progress believe that attacking symbols will weaken resolve," he began. They were wrong. The strength of our nation does not rest in palaces or protected individuals. It rests in communities that refuse to be intimidated, in citizens who watch out for one another, in the shared conviction that we are building something worth protecting. He paused, choosing his next words carefully. I asked my mother to accept security accommodations that would have made my heart easier. She refused, and I confess I was frustrated by her refusal. But she understood something I had temporarily forgotten, that leadership is not about protecting yourself. It is about living in a way that inspires others to courage. The speech was brief, barely 5 minutes, but its impact was substantial. It reframed the incident from a security failure to a community success, from a near tragedy to an affirmation of principles. International media coverage, which had initially focused on the security breach, shifted to examine the broader story. Documentaries were commissioned. Scholars wrote analysis pieces, but perhaps most significantly, the incident became a case study in military and security training programs worldwide, an example of how community-based security could complement traditional protective measures. Months passed. The attempted attack receded into memory, though the lessons it taught remained relevant. Life in the village continued its eternal rhythm, planting and harvest, birth and death, joy and sorrow. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, things began to change across the nation. The changes were not dramatic or sudden. There were no grand announcements or revolutionary decrees. Instead, there was a gradual shift in expectations and behaviors. Government officials found themselves held to different standards. When a minister proposed an expensive renovation of his official residence, the project was questioned in ways it would not have been before. "What would Amina say?" became a common refrain in budget discussions, in policy debates, in conversations about how public resources should be allocated. The phrase was sometimes used sarcastically, sometimes seriously, but always it represented a benchmark, a reminder that those who served the public should be willing to live within sight of those they served. Schools began incorporating Amina's story into civics curricula, not as propaganda, but as a case study in ethical decision-making. Students debated the choices she had made, examined the principles she had defended, and discussed how those principles might apply to their own lives. One particularly thoughtful teacher in the capital created an assignment that became widely adopted. Students were asked to identify a comfort or privilege in their own lives that they could surrender in favor of greater connection to community need. The responses ranged from shallow to profound, but the exercise itself, the act of considering such a choice, proved valuable. Artists found inspiration in the story. Painters depicted not Amina herself, but the symbolic elements of her choice: a simple mat, an open doorway, a village well. Musicians composed songs not about her specifically, but about the themes her life embodied: community, integrity, the courage to remain unchanged by power. A playwright wrote a piece called The Unmoved that premiered in the National Theater. It was not a biographical drama, but an exploration of the philosophical questions Amina's stance had raised. What is true security? When does protection become isolation? How do we honor those we wish to keep safe without removing them from the context that gives their lives meaning? 3 years after the initial refusal of the villa, Amina remained in her village home. The mat had been replaced several times, worn out by use and weather. The well had been repaired and deepened, not with government funds specifically allocated for that purpose, but as part of a broader rural development program that Amina's stance had helped inspire. The village itself had changed in subtle ways. Basic infrastructure had improved, not because Amina had demanded special treatment, but because her presence had drawn attention to the conditions that many rural communities endured. Other villages in the region had also seen improvements, a rising tide that lifted many boats. The informal gathering place near Amina's home had become an institution. People came not just from the village, but from surrounding areas to sit in that space, to talk, to share concerns and hopes. It had become known simply as the mat, a place where hierarchies dissolved and genuine conversation became possible. Political leaders visiting the region made a point of stopping at the mat, though they quickly learned that doing so required them to actually listen rather than merely perform. The space had a way of stripping pretense, of demanding authenticity. Those who came with prepared speeches and political calculations found themselves off balance, Forced into genuine dialogue, President Ibrahim visited twice a year, coming not with motorcades and security details, but with a small, low-key delegation. He sat with his mother on the mat, shared tea, and talked not about policy or politics, but about family, about values, about the challenges of trying to lead with integrity. These visits were rarely photographed or publicized. They were not for show. They were his way of remaining grounded, of checking himself against the standards his mother had always represented. On one such visit, Ibrahim confessed to feeling overwhelmed by the complexity of governance, by the constant trade-offs and compromises that leadership required. Amina listened, then said simply, "When you were a boy and the path ahead seemed unclear, what did I teach you?" "To look down at your feet," Ibrahim replied. "To take the next step that you can see clearly, rather than worrying about the destination you cannot yet reach." "And has that changed?" she asked. He smiled, understanding. The principles that guided a life were not different when that life involved national leadership. The scale was different, the consequences more far-reaching, but the fundamental questions remained the same. What is the right thing to do? What serves the common good? What can I do today that I will not regret tomorrow? Amina's example inevitably created uncomfortable comparisons. In neighboring countries, citizens began asking why their leaders required such elaborate protection, such expensive accommodations. If the mother of President Traoré could live simply and safely, what did it say about leaders who insisted on fortress-like compounds and massive security details? Some leaders responded defensively, arguing that their situations were different, their threats more severe, their responsibilities more complex. Others, more thoughtfully, began to reconsider the relationship between security and legitimacy. A president in a nearby nation, facing criticism about his expensive lifestyle, visited Amina. He came quietly without media fanfare, genuinely seeking to understand. They talked for hours, sitting in the shade of the neem tree. "I grew up in poverty," he told her. "I fought my way to education, to opportunity, to power. The comforts I now enjoy, they represent my victory over that poverty. Why should I not enjoy what I have earned? Did you fight only for yourself?" Amina asked gently. "Or did you fight for others who remain in poverty?" "For others," he insisted. "Of course for others." "Then your victory is not complete while they still struggle," she said. "True victory would be lifting them with you, not simply escaping their condition yourself." The conversation was challenging, even painful for him. But it was also transformative. He returned to his country and began implementing reforms, not dramatic gestures, but substantive policy changes that redirected resources toward education, healthcare, and infrastructure in underserved areas. He did not give up his official residence, but he significantly reduced expenditures on luxury upgrades. He did not eliminate his security detail, but he made sure they were not used merely to insulate him from contact with ordinary citizens. The changes were imperfect and incremental, but they were real. When asked by journalists what had prompted the shift, he said simply, "I met someone who showed me the difference between having power and earning authority." As Amina aged, her physical presence became more fragile, but her moral presence seemed to strengthen. She moved more slowly now, her hands showing the accumulated wear of decades of work. But her eyes remained clear, her mind sharp, her conviction undiminished. Young people from across the country began making pilgrimages to the village, seeking wisdom or inspiration or simply the experience of meeting someone who had become legendary. Amina received them regardless of circumstances. That is not wisdom. It is just stubbornness, or perhaps faithfulness to who I believe I should be. But to those who came seeking easy answers, she offered challenges instead. To the student who asked how to change the world, she said, "Start by changing how you treat the person next to you." To the activist seeking inspiration for grand campaigns, she said, "What are you doing today? In your own community? With your own hands?" Her challenges were gentle but penetrating. They redirected attention from abstract ideals to concrete actions, from distant goals to immediate opportunities for integrity and service. Letters continued to arrive, though Amina could no longer answer all of them personally. She read each one, though, and young people from the village helped her respond to those that seemed most urgent or heartfelt. The letters came from prisoners seeking redemption, from leaders struggling with ethical dilemmas, from ordinary people trying to navigate the tensions between personal ambition and social responsibility. One letter, from a teenage girl in the capital, captured something essential. "My mother says I should become successful so I can escape poverty. But you teach that success means not escaping, but transforming. How do I honor both my mother's hopes and your example?" Amina's response, dictated to a village teacher who wrote it down, acknowledged the complexity. Honor your mother by pursuing education and opportunity. But remember that the highest success is not measured by what you escape, but by what you bring back to share with others. In her 80s now, Amina's health began to decline. It was not dramatic or sudden, just the gradual diminishment that comes with age. She moved less, tired more easily, spent more time simply sitting and observing. President Ibrahim wanted to bring her to the capital for medical care, to give her access to the best doctors and facilities. The village where Amina lived remains much as it was, though with gradually improving infrastructure that came not from special treatment, but from sustained attention to rural development across the nation. Tourists occasionally visit, seeking the house where she lived, the mat where she sat. But the village has resisted becoming a shrine or tourist destination. It remains a living community, not a museum. A small plaque marks Amina's former home. The inscription is simple: she stayed. In that staying, she taught us how to stand. Perhaps the most fitting tribute comes from Asata, the young girl who wrote to Amina years before. Now a teacher herself, Asata has made it her life's work to serve in rural schools, bringing education to children in circumstances like those she experienced growing up. When asked why she chose this path, rather than pursuing more lucrative opportunities in the city, Asata's answer is simple: "I had a mother who showed me that the most important thing is not where you go, but who you are wherever you stay." And so the legacy continues, not in monuments or state holidays, but in countless individual choices to prioritize truth over comfort, community over isolation, integrity over convenience. Amina's refusal to move has inspired millions to stand their ground, to remain rooted in principles when power and privilege offer easier alternatives. The world is not transformed by grand gestures alone. Her life teaches us. It is transformed by the quiet courage of ordinary people who refuse to be moved from their convictions, who insist on remaining connected to those they serve, who understand that true security comes not from walls, but from the unbreakable bonds of community and the unshakable foundation of truth. In the end, Amina's greatest gift was not her refusal of a villa, but what that refusal represented: a life lived with such consistent integrity that changing circumstances could not change her fundamental nature. She remained herself, grounded and genuine, from the days when her son was unknown to the years when he wielded national power. That consistency, that unwavering authenticity, is what continues to inspire and challenge all who encounter her story. The mat has been replaced many times. The well has been repaired and deepened. The neem tree has grown older, its shade deeper and wider. But the lesson remains, carved not in stone, but in the choices of people who heard her story and decided to live differently because of it. And that, perhaps, is the truest monument, not a structure that stands apart from life, but a principle that lives within it, shaping decisions and inspiring courage in every generation that encounters it anew.